The brass casing felt cool against my thumb as I polished it, the rhythmic friction a small, familiar comfort in a world that had become anything but. We had taken the hill. Hill 734. The name meant nothing to anyone back home, but here, it was everything. For 3 weeks it had been a hornet's nest of concrete and steel, spitting fire down on us. Now, it was ours. The air, thick with the smell of cordite and churned earth, was finally quiet, save for the low laughter and clinking of canteens from the makeshift command post. We were celebrating. We had won. I slid the bolt of my rifle back into place, the metallic click a final, satisfying note in the symphony of our victory. That's when I first heard it. A whisper thin as a spider's thread that seemed to slither right into my ear. It said a name I hadn't heard in years. Clara. I froze, my hand tight on the rifle. It was the wind, I told myself. The wind whistling through the shattered bunkers and crevices of this god-forsaken rock. But the air was still. So still, you could hear a man cough 100 yards away. I looked over at Private First Class Davis, a kid barely 19, who was staring out into the darkness with wide, unnerved eyes. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur. I shook my head. A lie. I didn't want to give his fear a foothold. Sergeant Miller, a man carved from granite and cynicism, clapped Davis on the shoulder. "Hear what, kid? The enemy running for their lives? Get used to the sound of winning." But even as he said it, his eyes scanned the perimeter, a flicker of uncertainty in their depths. The celebration died down an hour later, the men crawling into their tents and sleeping bags, exhausted but triumphant. Sleep, however, refused to come to me. Every gust of wind sounded like a voice. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist. The hill was ours, but it felt like something else was here with us, something old and unwelcome that had been woken by the thunder of our guns. The door to our old life, the one where we just followed orders and shot at the enemy we could see, had slammed shut. We just didn't know it yet. The second night was worse. The whispers grew bolder. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were personal. Corporal Chen, our comms specialist, was on radio watch when he threw his headset down, his face pale as bone china. "It's playing music," he stammered, his hands shaking. "An old lullaby. My mother, she used to sing it to me." We all listened. There was nothing but static. Sarge told him he was cracking up, that the stress was getting to him. But later that night I saw Chen sitting by himself, rocking back and forth, humming that same tune under his breath. The next morning his bunk was empty. We found him at the base of the hill. He'd walked straight off the steepest cliff face. There was a single, peaceful smile on his face. Sarge logged it as a combat fatigue casualty, accidental death. But we all knew. Something had called to him, and he had answered. We started trying to go back to the way things were. We reinforced the bunkers, ran patrol patterns, cleaned our weapons until the metal gleamed. We tried to impose our order, our familiar military logic, onto the creeping madness, but the hill resisted. It fought back in ways we couldn't comprehend. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in impossible places. A shovel left by the trench would be found perched atop the radio antenna. A compass would spin wildly in one man's hand, while the man next to him got a perfect reading. The whispers became a constant, insidious presence. They preyed on our deepest secrets. Miller, who never spoke of his family, was heard arguing with an unseen figure in his tent, yelling the name Sarah over and over. Davis, the young private, claimed to see a little girl with dark hair at the edge of the camp, a girl who looked exactly like the sister he'd lost to a fever when he was 10. I tried to fight it with reason. I told myself it was a trick. Some kind of enemy psychological operation. We swept the hill for speakers, for projectors, for anything that could explain what was happening. We found nothing, not a wire, not a footprint. The enemy we were fighting was technologically primitive. They used old rifles and brute force. They didn't have the resources for this kind of sophisticated warfare. The possibility that they did was, in some ways, more terrifying than the alternative. It meant they understood us. They knew our names, our histories, our fears. My own personal torment was the name Clara. It was whispered on the wind when I was on watch. I'd hear it in the crackle of the fire. Clara was the girl I was supposed to marry, the girl I'd left behind with a promise to return. The whisper never sounded like her, though. It was distorted, mocking. It would tell me things. That she'd moved on, that she'd met someone else, that she was happy I was gone. I would lie in my sleeping bag, fists clenched, sweat beading on my forehead, telling myself it wasn't real. But a seed of doubt, once planted, has deep roots. The unit began to fray. Paranoia became our constant companion. Men started looking at each other with suspicion. Who was talking in their sleep? Who was humming that strange tune? A fight broke out between two soldiers who had been friends since basic training, an argument over a missing photograph that ended with a broken jaw. We were turning on each other. The hill was digesting us. We tried to call it in, to report the strange occurrences, but how could we? What would we say? "Sir, the hill is haunted. It knows our secrets." They would have pulled us for psychiatric evaluation before the transmission even ended. We were alone up here, trapped on our prize, and it was exacting a terrible price. Sarge Miller was the anchor that kept us from floating away completely. He was a rock. He handed out punishments for fighting, organized extra patrols, and forced us through drills until our muscles burned. He was trying to use discipline as a shield against the encroaching chaos. But I could see the cracks forming. His eyes were perpetually bloodshot. He'd stop mid-sentence, listening for a sound no one else could hear. One evening he gathered us together. "Listen up," he growled, his voice rough. "There is nothing out there that isn't in your own heads. It's the altitude, it's combat stress, it's the damn food. But it is not real. You are United States soldiers. Act like it. We will not be broken by shadows." It was a good speech. For a moment it felt like the old Sarge was back. We felt a surge of hope. That night every single one of us had the same dream. We were walking through a thick fog, and from the mist, people from our pasts emerged. Parents, siblings, old friends, lost loves. They didn't speak. They just stared at us with hollow, accusing eyes. We all woke up screaming. The hope shattered. The hill was no longer just a strategic position. It was a living entity, a predator, and we were its prey. Davis was the next to go. We were on patrol along the western ridge. He suddenly stopped, pointing into the gloom. "She's there," he whispered, his face alight with a terrible joy. "She's waiting for me." He started walking towards the edge of the ridge, his arms outstretched. We yelled for him to stop, but he didn't seem to hear us. He just kept walking, a blissful smile on his face, right into the darkness. We never even heard him land. There were only 8 of us left now, from a platoon of 30. We were skeletons rattling around in a tomb of our own making. The fear was a physical thing, a constant pressure in my chest, a cold weight in my stomach. The whispers had stopped trying to be subtle. Now they laughed. A cold, empty sound that echoed across the hill. I decided I couldn't just wait to be picked off. My search for a rational explanation became an obsession. It was the only thing keeping me sane. While others huddled in their tents, I scoured the hill. I mapped every trench, every shell crater, every collapsed bunker. I was convinced there had to be an answer, an old tunnel system maybe, a strange mineral in the rock that caused hallucinations. Anything but the truth I was most afraid of, that we had simply, finally, gone mad. It was in one of the deepest, most collapsed bunkers that I found something. It was almost completely buried, a small concrete room that had survived the shelling. The air inside was stale and cold. In the far corner, half buried under rubble, was a small metal box. It was a field radio, but older than any model I'd ever seen. It was covered in dust, but it looked functional. Beside it was a leather-bound journal. My heart hammered against my ribs. The journal's pages were brittle, the ink faded. The writing was in a language I didn't recognize, but the script was elegant, precise. There were dates, going back decades. And next to some of the entries were drawings, sketches of soldiers. Not our soldiers. Soldiers from a different time, a different war, wearing uniforms I barely recognized from history books. They were all in distress. Some were clutching their heads, others were screaming at unseen things. The last entry was dated almost 40 years prior, and then I saw it. Tucked into the back cover of the journal was a single folded page, written in English. It was a warning. It wasn't a formal report, but a frantic, desperate letter from a soldier to his brother. He wrote that they had taken this hill, just as we had. He wrote of victory turning to dread. He wrote of whispers on the wind, of men seeing ghosts of their past, of friends losing their minds one by one. He called the hill the Echo. He said it didn't create the ghosts, it only reflected them. It took the grief and fear inside a man and gave it a voice, a shape. It fed on despair. He wrote that the only way to survive was to have nothing left for it to take, no hope, no fear, no love, to become as empty as the wind that carried the whispers. His last line was chilling. If you are reading this, it is already too late for you. It has you. Run. A cold dread washed over me, colder than the bunker's stale air. This wasn't the enemy, this was the hill itself. This piece of land was a wound on the earth, a place that amplified the horrors of war. We hadn't been attacked by a secret weapon. We had been infected by the place itself. I ran back to the command post, clutching the journal. I had to show Sarge. He had to see. He was the only one left who might listen to reason. I found him standing on the edge of the command bunker, staring out at the valley below. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, but he wasn't looking at the enemy lines. He was looking at something much farther away. "Do you hear them, James?" he asked, his voice strangely calm. "They're singing tonight. It's beautiful." The air was silent, utterly silent. The whispers had stopped. But the silence was somehow worse. It was heavy, expectant. I held out the journal. "Sarge, I found something. An explanation." He didn't even look at it. He just smiled, a sad, distant smile. "An explanation? There's no need for one. I understand now. We didn't win this hill, James. It let us have it. It was hungry." He turned to me, and for the first time, I saw that the rock-solid Sergeant Miller was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out shell, his eyes vacant, reflecting a private horror I could only imagine. "She's waiting for me, you know," he said softly. "Sarah, and our boy. He has her eyes." Before I could react, before I could say a word, he took a step forward. He walked off the edge of the bunker, into the night, as calmly as if he were stepping off a curb. Now, there were only 3 of us left. Me and 2 other privates, both catatonic with fear, huddled in a tent, rocking back and forth. The hill was finally completely quiet. The echo had feasted, and now it was content. It had taken everything from us. Our friends, our sanity, our hope. And in the silence, a new kind of fear began to grow. The fear of being the last one. The journal had said the only way to survive was to be empty. As I sat there, listening to the quiet breathing of the 2 broken men beside me, I realized the hill had failed with me. It had whispered of Clara, of my loss. It had tried to use my love for her against me. But it had made a mistake. It reminded me that I still had something to lose. Something to live for. It had reminded me of my promise. The sky began to lighten in the east. A new day was coming. I stood up. I picked up my rifle. I checked my ammunition. The hill was quiet, but it wasn't dead. It was just waiting for the next meal. But I wasn't going to be on the menu. I walked over to the 2 privates. I shook them, gently at first, then harder. "Get up," I said, my voice raw. "We're leaving." They stared at me with empty eyes. "It's over," I said, more to myself than to them. "We're getting off this hill. I didn't know if we would make it. I didn't know if the enemy was waiting for us down below. I didn't know if we could outrun the echoes in our own minds. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid. The hill had taken its toll. It had scoured me down to the bone, but it hadn't broken me. It had shown me the absolute price of this war. It's not just paid in blood and bodies. It's paid in pieces of your soul, in memories turned to poison, in the silence that comes after the screaming stops. We won the land, a meaningless patch of dirt and rock. But the hill won the war. And as the 3 of us began our slow, stumbling descent, I knew that even if we survived, we would carry its whispers with us for the rest of our lives.